meeting, Tuesday, March 19th, 2024, 12 p.m. at Montrose City Hall. Roll call, David Paradise.
Dr. Sonia Turgo.
Shannon Screen with David Brown Associates.
Jackie Hines.
Jessica Monroe.
Gabby Stroh.
We also have Ron from Kennedy and Graven on Zoom.
Yes, hi.
We got an approval of the agenda.
So moved.
I will second. All in favor? Aye. Approval of the minutes from January 16th, 2024.
I move to approve the minutes. Second.
All right, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And treasurer's report.
The EDA Authority Fund is sitting at $257,277.77, and there's been no change with the Economic Development Revolving Loan Fund, which is sitting at $257,754.78.
Any questions on that? All right. There's no old business, so we'll move into the new business. We'll start with the business subsidy policy.
I'll dive in. I sent you guys some stuff. Ultimately, the city's had a business subsidy request. That's the second part of the agenda, and we can talk about that conceptually. But at the end of the day, when we received that request, I'd asked staff for a copy of the business subsidy policy because I was expecting that the request was going to exceed the parameters of what state statute says is either financial assistance or a business subsidy. And if it reaches those thresholds, we're required to have a policy on file that we've adopted after holding a public hearing. And so ultimately, the definition of those two things, a business subsidy is any sort of grant or something we wouldn't do for everybody else that exceeds $150,000. Financial assistance is anything along those lines that's more than $25,000. It can be putting in infrastructure for free. It can be providing a grant of some sort, waiving a fee, tax increment financing or tax abatement assistance. All those things are different forms of business subsidies, and ultimately we should decide if we wish to work through the process of creating a policy and making a recommendation to the city council with regard to adopting such a policy. Not here today to tell you that's something you have to do. I would tell you if you are planning to provide a financial assistance or recommend that or provide a business subsidy, you need to have a policy in place in order to do that. And so I provided a draft. It was one that I had worked on with the city of Winsted some time ago. I thought it was a good middle of the road version of a policy. You'll see these things as short as 1 or 2 pages and as long as 10 pages. And so ultimately you can make it as easy or complicated as you care to. But at the end of the day, you have to address a few issues that are, required by Minnesota statute. And so, if you care to walk through the draft policy, it first references purpose and authority. And it talks about the fact that these are authorized in Minnesota statutes 116J993 through 995. If you ever care to read the statute attributed to this, that's where it's located, and it will tell you specifically, it defines what a business subsidy is not in great detail. Everything else is essentially a business subsidy. And so we memorialized that list on the last page of this draft policy. That's essentially a copy of statute, at least at that time, with regard to what is not a business subsidy. And so you'll see it says funding of less than $150,000 is not a business subsidy. But under statute, it makes a reference to anything between $25,000 and $150,000 being financial assistance, and that still requires us to have a policy in place. What we get out of by doing something of less than 150,000 or can essentially avoid is potentially a public hearing and job requirements. And so, ultimately statute says if it's 150,000 or more, job creation has to be a goal. If it's not going to be a goal, we have to reference that in our public hearing that job creation is not a goal for a project. And we have to talk about or address or make findings associated with why we're still providing a business subsidy, even though that job creation isn't part of the deal. So, we list public purposes down in section 2. You know, economic growth, create high quality jobs, to remove blight, to redevelop blighted and underutilized areas, provide diversity in housing. When we get into housing, you know, recognize that housing is not a business subsidy, and whether you have a section devoted to housing in your policy is completely up to you. That would not be required for purposes of business subsidy assistance, but some folks choose to address both issues within the policy. To increase local business and industrial market potential, to offset increased costs of redevelopment, to accelerate the development process, to finance or provide public infrastructure. We can talk about providing additional services that aren't already available. Lots of different things can fall under the reasons why we're interested in doing this. The reason that we provide such a list is typically when we're approving something or denying something, we're pointing to these findings to say these are the reasons why we're in favor of or we don't support. You know, it can be it's not creating enough jobs, or it is providing a service that isn't already available. You know, those are the things we point to as we look to provide a business subsidy. Typically in our policy, we have a statement that, you know, ultimately it's at the sole discretion of the city council in order to determine whether or not they're going to provide a business subsidy. There's no precedent setting, for example, that, you know, an applicant can point to because each project is reviewed on its own merits. And those merits are identified under this policy, and that's why we make findings associated with why we're doing something. State statute references that creation of tax base shall not be a sole purpose for a business subsidy, and ultimately that's why we have that list of other reasons why we would consider granting it. We talk about the job creation component, and you know, if we are approving a subsidy and job creation is not a component, the reasons why that might be allowed. And in 2.5 we get into some more specifics with regard to improving public infrastructure, removes physical impediments to development. Those can be poor soils. Oftentimes it's a dilapidated building. You know, at the end of the day, I see business subsidies rationalized or justified for redevelopment purposes, even if they don't meet the redevelopment tests associated with this, as what are the extraordinary costs of developing a site that's occupied by substandard properties as compared to developing on a similar green site that doesn't have a facility. Usually there's additional costs associated with demolition, remediation of, you know, environmental issues like asbestos, things like that create extraordinary costs, which is why government may get involved in a subsidy in order to promote the redevelopment of that property. Those are the kinds of things that we're pointing to when we say to remove impediments to development. So, we have business subsidy approval criteria under section 3 in this draft policy. You know, ultimately, we say we need to comply with state statute, which we do regardless. We have to achieve a public purpose within this policy as we define. Project must comply with local plans and ordinances, which is a no-brainer, but it's a good thing to restate. The recipient shall provide information demonstrating that granting the business subsidy is necessary for the proposed project to occur. Now, in tax increment financing law, there's a test that's referred to as the but-for test that says, but for the assistance to be provided, the project would proceed, essentially. You can decide to have a similar finding required for a business subsidy, meaning that the applicant has to demonstrate that they wouldn't proceed with the project unless the business subsidy is provided. That gets into unique and long and unusual conversations at times, but ultimately, many think it's an important test that we have to address in this process. And so having such a test included in your policy is not unique. Just recognize that if we ever have a project where the developer says, well, I'm going to do this anyway, but, if you're feeling like nice people today, if you could give me a little of assistance, and that assistance is in fact something that meets the criteria or is financial assistance or a business subsidy, all of a sudden we've triggered that but-for finding requirement that's in our policy. Not a bad thing, but we just got to understand it's there and it needs to be addressed if we include it. It also means if you have such a test that you shouldn't have issued a building permit before the subsidy issue is addressed. Because if somebody has a building permit, I think Brian would tell you that that means that they're intending to do this project regardless of whether there's a business subsidy in place. And so ultimately, if we have that but-for test in our policy, they shouldn't be pulling a building permit until they have approval on the subsidy requirement. That last sentence is, philosophically accurate. Any business subsidy will be at the lowest possible level and for the least amount of time necessary after the recipient first maximizes the use of private debt and equity financing. We want to have a goal of minimizing our subsidy if we're participating in a project. And then in the final segment, we talk about the need for an agreement. Essentially, statute makes these requirements for business subsidies. We have to report on financial assistance and business subsidies to the state of Minnesota. And so this formalizes that we have to have an agreement. It has to have stipulations. If it's a business subsidy in particular, it has to have repayment provisions, meaning that we can claw back any assistance that we provide if goals are not met, particularly job creation goals. And so those are all things that are statutory requirements. There's a few discretionary items in here, but essentially this is meant to walk you down the path of complying with statute. If you want to see additional copies or drafts of different business subsidy policies, I'm happy to provide those. I just gave you, again, this one middle of the road draft to initiate the conversation so you understood what I was talking about. Happy to answer your questions, take your direction, do whatever you see fit on this topic. But since we have a request that we're going to discuss next, I wanted you to be aware of this policy matter.
When it comes to the but-for, and I don't know, kind of just making sure that we're not being held hostage, is there anything you can put in there for, hey, if you've got, building permit, you're past the process. Like, is there anything we can put into this?
I think you could make that statement, as part of that, as an example of the but-for test.
Yeah.
You could describe further what you mean by that but-for test.
Okay.
Sure. I think providing a more direct description of that is absolutely permissible.
So are we having to give the go-ahead, or is it this council that are we
Ultimately, the
recommending
council, it'd be a recommendation from this group.
to the council?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would suggest that at the end of the day, you're recommending a policy to them because you're the entity that was created to focus on economic development. And so having a draft that you folks like first and then forwarding it to the city council, I think is what you were created to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the plan.
I mean, overall, I think it's definitely needed that we have to have this. I think, I would say 90% there, with what we have, and just kind of, even adopting this and making tweaks as we go. I think it's, if we wanna get this in sooner than later to the city.
Yeah, what I would suggest is, now that you've heard my spiel, take it home, review it one more time, mark it up. You can easily go online and find other samples of policies in Minnesota. And if you wanna do that, if you want me to send you some more policy copies, let me know that too, and I'm happy to do that. And you can just look at, everything that's available in the world and then decide what seems to fit Montrose. And, we can come back at our next meeting, take those comments and what you like and don't like, and try to put together a bit of a final draft from there.
If we had that for next meeting and had you start working on a final draft, would that be ready for then the May meeting with city council? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be our intent.
Okay.
Could I, or where to look them up, I guess, too, but, request Delano, Buffalo, and Waverly policies,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
as they're around.
If I could just add a couple comments, I think Shannon did a good job summarizing the statute. I do think it's important to have a policy in place, whether the next item turns out to be a business subsidy or qualifies as a business subsidy, and whether you want to recommend approval or not is kind of beside the point. Having a policy in place so that you can address future requests, I think, is a very good idea. I took a quick look at what Shannon provided. I think, as you said, it's sort of the middle of the road. These things are kind of generic. I've drafted many of them over the years. They say much of the same things, but I think it is worth spending a little bit of time and tweaking it to the degree that makes sense to meet the local preferences and goals. In other words, if redevelopment is a strong goal or if job creation is a strong goal, I think it makes sense to make sure that the policy addresses that. As Shannon kind of indicated, this doesn't establish any kind of contractual right. This is a general statement. All projects have to be evaluated on their individual merit, and nobody can demand a business subsidy because you have a policy. It just gives you a framework in which to evaluate requests that do qualify as business subsidies, but also a framework to look at things that are not business subsidies because they fit in an exception. You're still being asked to provide public money, even if it meets an exception, and it's good to have something to evaluate those requests in comparison to.
Absolutely. Anybody else have any questions for Shannon or for Ron?
Yeah, I think getting a couple more to look at,
Yep.
for example,
Yep.
and then we can make comments, and if anybody has any comments, can email me and I can forward to Shannon, and maybe by April 5th, and then, so we can have some time to put that together for the April 1st maybe.
Yeah, I would say, let's all shoot for any comments, from this one, from the ones that you researched from it and Shannon gives. Give those comments to Jessica by the 5th, that way we can have everything ready to go.
What's a good date for that, Shannon, you think, the 1st or the 5th?
What's the next meeting date in April?
The 16th.
Oh, 5th is fine.
Okay.
And that's a Friday, I believe.
Yes.
Yep. So, well, let's plan on that so we can have everything in a row and Shannon can put something together and talk further into maybe some other things that we saw or whatever.
And Ron, if you had any comments on that additional, or that policy that was sent out, send them to me, if there's any tweaks that you saw in your review.
Yeah, I'll look through it a little bit more closely and give you any comments that I may have.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Well, thank you, Shannon.
Yeah.
We'll get to the next item here. So we have the business subsidy request from SJB Masonry.
Yeah. As we mentioned we didn't have a complete request. There was additional information that was lacking in the application. Some of that's been collected as recent as last night. I did receive an email from the applicant indicating that we had heard back from the county with a preliminary estimate of market value. I would think it's probably pretty preliminary because usually they'll say we're not going to respond for a week or two before they get it back, but we did provide them with information. They indicated that they felt the facility, a preliminary estimate with no guarantees, was $3,775,000 for the facility. At that market value, I had projected that, I'll pass this out. I gave these copies for a reason. So this looks similar to information I provided previously that was a tax increment projection. This is a slightly different format because it's tax abatement. Now, what's different in this request is that tax abatement with TIF, I'll start with TIF. We recently just approved an agreement for a housing project. When we create a tax increment district, we're capturing city, county, and a portion of the school district property tax and redistributing that for either our purposes or as a subsidy. In this housing project, it was as a subsidy. And so with tax abatement, we only act on our share or the city's share of the property tax stream. And so there are fewer regulations associated with doing that because we're not stealing other people's property taxes. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, there's public purposes that need to be identified in that process. The tests aren't difficult for something like this. You know, ultimately, our business subsidy policy would help us determine if it's appropriate in this instance. But at the end of the day, with tax abatement, we're acting only on the city's portion of the property tax revenue. And this projection calculates only that portion of the city tax that's attributed to the increase in market value as a result of the project. So the existing property has a market value of $685,300. I wasn't aware, but I'm assuming that must mean there's a facility on that existing site because that market value was quite high on one parcel and not the other. And so, is that the case? Is there existing facilities on that site?
The Excel Energy Building is like the next parcel over.
They gave us 2 parcel ID numbers in the application, and that's what I plugged into the system. And they were both under the ownership of SJB Holdings. So I wasn't sure, but one parcel is assigned a market value of $42,000, and the other has a $600,000 market value. It's what they have in their application. It's the ownership that they reference here of Loretto Bay 3 LLC. They are both under the ownership of that entity. So I'm assuming that it was an accurate market value at this point. And so the incremental increase in property tax attributed to the city from what it's being taxed at today to what it will be taxed at if they build a facility that's valued at $3,775,000 is at $27,292 a year. That's the additional city property tax over what's being paid today that would be paid in the future if the facility is constructed at the market value that, you know, the assessor's given a preliminary indication of what will be constructed. This developer is requesting 18 years of reimbursement of that amount. Under tax abatement law, the unit of government can provide up to 15 years of reimbursement unless another unit of government declines to participate in the tax abatement. So, if they made a written request to the school district and the school district said, we're not going to abate our taxes, the duration of the city's subsidy could be extended to 20 years. We don't typically see subsidies of that duration or the requirement to make that request unless we're funding something unique. And that isn't the case that I'm aware of in this instance. And so ultimately, they've asked for $27,292 per year in reimbursement of property tax. The city, under this scenario, would continue to collect the property tax associated with the existing $685,300 in market value. You would be foregoing the benefit of that additional $27,292 in local property tax for whatever duration was negotiated if you chose to even proceed with the subsidy request. So I wanted to quantify that for you. The other item that they requested was the waiver of SAC and WAC charges. Those are sewer access charges and water access charges. Those are connection fees charged by the city. In this instance, the preliminary estimate of those fees is $26,400 are the fees that would be paid when the building permit is issued. And so they request that those be waived. I'm never a fan of waiving those connection fees. Ultimately, it sets a bad precedent. The city's exploring becoming a member of a regional sanitary sewer system. In the future, if you join that system, you wouldn't be waiving those connection fees because you have to turn over this portion of the sewer portion to the entity that's providing the service that you're a part of. And so, in advance of that, I would say that it's not necessarily great practice to start that before we're embarking on that journey. Certainly what I do see is if assistance is provided, it's a reimbursement for those costs. So if you said, well, we'll do tax abatement, but it will be just to reimburse that $26,400, but we're not waiving the fee, you're paying it. We're just reimbursing it with the new property taxes that you generate through tax abatement. I'm not trying to sit here and talk you into providing a subsidy for the project. I'm just here to answer questions and talk about what the developer has requested. And I'm happy to dive further into that conversation as you folks see fit. So,
Well, are you two up to date on kind of the project and what this is gonna bring to the city at all? So we met with them last meeting at the city council, and kind of one of my big questions that I wanted answered was asking about what is the benefit to the city? What jobs are we creating here? He's not bringing any jobs.
No.
He's transferring his business over here, so.
And he said at some point it might create a job, somebody quits or
Yeah,
whatever, but, with turnover, with natural turnover, but.
what I would make clear though is most Minnesota cities would view the jobs that relocate to the community, even though they're not new jobs in the state of Minnesota, they would call those new jobs to the city, and they would consider that job creation in the city. Not saying that's how it's viewed and that's how it's rationalized by other cities, not saying you have to do that, but that's how they would view it.
How many,
So, go ahead.
how many employees do they have now?
what do you say, there's couple drivers, I wanna say maybe a total of 3 or 4 administrative, maybe 9 working, so we're talking like 15 to 20, I think.
Yeah.
I think it was.
Mhm. So they're building a building, and from part of it, it says that some of it would be leased out. What kind of potential leased out businesses
So-
could go in there? Are they talking other construction businesses? Is it like, commercial businesses are selling something?
I think it's mostly gonna be like office space, like small portions of office space where people go in and work in.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna be like a business front where.
What about that? So 24,000 square feet I thought was not office or something in that magnitude, and half of that wasn't gonna be occupied by them. They've made references to pickleball courts, or
And a
leasing it
gym.
out, or leasing it out for other purposes. But that space that they've also indicated they're constructing now as they intend to grow into it. So I think it's up for grabs on what might be in there at this point. I don't know that that's well defined at all.
Just thinking out, you know, because in this community, there's a lack of buildings for people to put businesses in. So that's where I'm like, okay, what does this look like?
Sure.
Is it just gonna be one extra place where somebody could put a business? Or is it gonna be something that actually people could, you know?
Yeah, because I think what you're thinking of is something like what, I believe it's Annandale, they have kind of an incubator building where it's, you know, 10 or so spaces that people can then lease out for, I think it's like a 2 to 3 year period only, to basically get to a brick and mortar style location after that. I don't necessarily feel like this is what's being,
No,
you know,
Anticipated.
offered here.
yeah, I expect it being more warehouse space that if somebody else had use for it,
Okay,
it would be available, but only until such time as they saw that they needed it for their
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
well, I just have no idea, so I'm just,
And we couldn't possibly say that they have to rent it out to another business, like, we couldn't put those, I mean, that's,
In this, if you were providing a subsidy, could we stipulate something like that? Perhaps. I think it would be difficult to enforce over time.
Yeah.
Simply because they're gonna be looking for ways to generate revenue from that space until they need to occupy it.
right, yeah.
and it's not defined whether it's office area.
It's
in
not
front of
office
it.
area.
It's,
I think it's like days, like.
Days,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's warehouse space essentially.
okay, I was just curious,
Yeah.
that just gives me a different idea, what does it bring to the community, you know?
Mhm.
Not saying extra jobs isn't good,
I mean, I think there definitely is a growth potential and a growth path that he's on, which will bring more jobs. It's just not gonna be something that our citizens are gonna feel right away as a potential new place to go work. You know, not like the way that CCC has it and stuff like that, where that's a huge, you know, job creation zone for the city.
What does this company do?
Concrete.
There's a lot of offices for concrete.
They have lots of staff that aren't on site that they manage, so.
and where is this going?
So if you go right down Clementa,
Okay.
you know where the Excel plant is?
Mhm.
Supposed to be right in that area.
Okay, that's what I understood, but
Right in that cul-de-sac.
yeah,
And, you know, as this is all new information that wasn't in your packet, you know, we should talk about our evaluation process, you know, in conjunction with what we're doing on our subsidy policy. It would be good to be able to respond to the business owner with the timeline for consideration. And so, at the end of the day, I'm looking for more input on, well, perhaps initial reaction even, but at the end, but process that we see going forward, I expect it follows a similar timeline as our business subsidy policy if we're recommending any sort of a subsidy. So, because we have to have the policy in place first, so.
What's kind of the process of them applying right now for a subsidy through the city? Like,
They submit an application, and, you know, from there, I collect some information and present it to you folks for a recommendation to the city council. I mean, we're developing this process now.
Yeah.
This is,
so when, let's just say like in May, when we have potentially this whole subsidy policy finalized, could we have more of a, on the application, kind of a breakdown, like what boxes are you checking?
yes.
You know, so that
We-
maybe they can understand when they're gonna get turned down, you know?
Yes. We
And,
can certainly do that. We've put together an application,
Mhm.
based on something that other folks use. It doesn't provide those boxes, well, it kinda does, but yeah, it does. It has a public purpose and they check boxes. They said job creation, which I would say is
Mhm.
common,
Mhm.
you know, in the context that I've explained it. If somebody's going from one city to another city, it's still characterized typically as job creation in that city.
so with that kind of explanation of job creation, I mean, is that checking a box here for the subsidy in your mind?
It would normally, yes, but that doesn't have to be your policy. But typically, a policy doesn't say new jobs to the state of Minnesota, it's new jobs to the community. So, and that's how it's generally interpreted.
Well, and to have future plans to fill this space, they're gonna need workers, ideally, you would think.
Hopefully.
So,
You know, and regardless of whether the jobs are new to the state or to the community, go back to what Shannon said earlier about, but for, but for is not the right term, because this isn't tax increment, but you get the sentiment. Even if these are new jobs to the community, is this a project that's going to happen anyway?
Yeah.
And I think that's the key.
Yes.
so you had said something earlier about we need to know what our goals are. You said something about job growth or
It can be
services growth, is that what you said?
It's all those things, yes. It can be job creation, it can be new services available in the community. Tax base can be part of the conversation, which this is. You know, there's a variety of things.
So what is our, I feel like we need all of them,
Mhm.
but is there one thing that's more prevalent? I'm just trying to understand so I can think about it properly.
Like the goals of the city, have you guys had other goals? Or like, does the city council have a main focus for the city of Montrose? Out of all of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been things that have been put on hold till we finalize the wastewater plant, but I mean, it's, there's a housing bill that we have here, to bring in more development on that piece. And I would say that's bucket number one, because bucket number two is then bringing in the businesses. Businesses aren't gonna come if we don't have the people.
And bringing in businesses that can possibly offer a service or
Yeah.
offer goods
You know,
or something.
exactly, we're talking, down the road, maybe there's a grocery
Or
store that wants to come in because we have enough, rooftops, that's what they're gonna look at.
Yeah.
So I would say right now is the housing is priority number one for us as a council in the right way, growing at a good pace that's right for the city. But then so that potential businesses see what we're doing and can, mark us down as a potential landing spot.
So curious, because we've grown significantly, and how many rooftops do we have currently?
I would say what about
It's not
1,500
like
rooftops, maybe?
1,300, yeah, I mean, it's not enough.
Yeah.
What is typically the goal?
I mean,
More.
yeah, more in a sustained growth way, So we're not just gonna open up everything and just say go build
Right.
and build cheap and all that stuff. So
No,
there's a process to it. I mean, we're surrounded, we got kind of Watertown and Waverly and then Howard Lake, but then we also have Buffalo and Delano. So it's kind of, we have to stay with the Buffalo and Delanos of the world, not one for one, but we have to be growing more than the other surrounding too.
right. No, I understand that. How about for businesses to be here? How many rooftops do they say?
It varies,
Yeah.
based on what kind of food, like
Yeah.
fast food ones are looking for.
Well, probably population in Waconia, we saw a drastic change in commercial businesses at 13,000.
I was gonna say like 10,000 population or something,
They did submit some financial projections to try to support their request for assistance, showing a low rate of return, which is ultimately what you're demonstrating when you're asking for a subsidy request. At the end of the day though, I mean, they've got their zoning approvals now. What have they indicated for their timeline for pulling a building permit?
Well, he wants as soon as possible, kind of.
So has he submitted materials?
He has not submitted anything
Okay.
for a building permit, I think he's kind of waiting for this to shake out, so.
Okay, so,
But I don't know that this is going to be a deal breaker. I guess I haven't
Yeah.
had that conversation with
And
her.
that can be the difficult part to judge at the end of the day. You feel they're bluffing and you're calling their bluff by saying, no, we're not gonna do a subsidy. You simply renegotiate enough for something less that seems to fit more of the parameters, or do you do nothing, ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, just say, let's see if they're serious and gonna proceed anyway, so.
I mean, yeah, my initial thoughts are, I mean, the reason to bring in a business like this is to capture that
The tax
tax
base.
Mm-hmm.
and lessen the load on our citizens.
Right, and by giving it back to them.
It's counterproductive to what we're trying to do here and make living a little bit easier out in Montrose.
Yeah.
Shannon, did you say that they own the property?
I think we did.
Well, it's owned by Loretto Bay 3 LLC. I don't know who that is.
Yeah, so that it's just an owner in Loretto, and I know that the developer has been working with them on like a purchase agreement. I think it's kind of pending approvals.
They have a
and
purchase
process.
agreement, but it's pending approval.
Yeah.
So they have site control to do their zoning stuff, but they haven't pulled the trigger on ownership, it sounds like.
Yeah, I was asking, because obviously if they bought the property, that's
Yeah.
a pretty good indication
Right, that
Yeah.
they're
they're
ready.
going forward.
Yeah,
Right.
agreed.
So then what I'm hearing regarding the council and everything is that it's not necessarily the best option to give them this.
Well, I mean, it ultimately, it's a recommendation that we're giving to the council.
Or maybe a conversation about, coming to an agreement about a lower amount, or
I mean, I could
compromise.
I could look at having us sit down, but I mean, we're gonna have to have a discussion on not only the total amount, but also the length
Yes.
of
Yeah,
term.
totally.
Like,
Yeah, that's a long.
there's a lot of things at play here,
Yeah.
that, either way, I don't think he's gonna get what he's asking for, from our recommendation, but I mean, I feel like I feel like the process is moving forward. I don't feel like, to Jess's point, I don't feel like we're threatening to lose this potential. And in the same sense, I also, what's there to gain if we have 18 years of not capturing that tax?
That's a long time.
It's a very long time,
I agree.
But so would you look at like half, if you got half of it versus none of it? Would you go 10 years versus 20 years?
I mean, I'd need more than half, because if you look at it, we're supposedly getting almost 13,000 right now.
It would be, that's the
Additional.
tax capacity,
Okay.
so if
What
I
would
take
that
that, it's a little less than half of that.
be? Okay, so we're getting about 6 then?
Yeah, you're getting about
Okay,
$6
so
grand.
we're getting about $6,000 right now.
Yeah,
So,
then you'd be adding an additional 27,292 to that.
I mean, I'd look at what, I just personally, I feel like this is moving on. This is moving forward. He's working towards buying the
Or
land.
maybe it's worth having a sit down and
I-
just kind of going over this with him.
And I'm good with that,
Because
and
he wasn't able to come.
yeah, but I'm absolutely fine with saying, like, right now, I mean, the what he's proposing is a no.
Yeah.
But we would like to have a sit down to, maybe see if there's something that can be done, because I think that shows good faith,
Yep, I think it's a reasonable response.
But I think that we have to put his expectations and simmer him down a little bit.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
I agree.
So,
So invite him to the next regular meeting, or is there some different format for that?
I mean, I feel like we can bring him to the next meeting, because
We're still gonna be in the process.
Yeah,
we'll
of
still be in this
approving,
process, so I mean,
So
it's not,
like, we're gonna be ahead of ourselves.
yeah. And that's, obviously I don't want this to, have him slow down what he's doing, but I want
It might, but we have to go through the subsidy policy process.
Right.
anyway.
No, yeah,
If he wants the benefit, I mean, he'll have to wait, you know.
Yeah.
For the
no, for
process.
sure, yeah. So I just,
And the other thing to remember from a procedural standpoint is, given the numbers that Shannon mentioned, it would only take about 6 years of the abatement to qualify as a business subsidy.
mhm,
And then you'd have, there has to be a hearing for the tax abatement. I mean, there are other procedures that we'd have to go through.
and that's if council approves it, correct?
And even if it's,
Yes.
even if it's 1 year, it's more than 25,000, and we have to have a financial assistance agreement and comply with business subsidy law, which we have to have a policy in place, so.
Yeah, and maybe it's worth having a conversation about lowering it and maybe reimbursing for some of those fees, you
Sure.
know?
Sure.
And maybe doing it just for a couple of, I don't know. Yeah. It's worth having a conversation.
I mean, as far as the
Cause it's
second whack,
$26,000.
charges, especially as you pointed, like you said, with what we're doing right now and connecting, hopefully with
Yeah, in the
regionalization.
future, we wouldn't be, we would have to pay at least the amount that we owe to.
Yeah, I mean, and
Commission.
yeah, it's, and I, being that it's a concrete company, it's gonna be a heavy use area,
Oh, for sure.
for this system as well. So, I don't, like you said, I don't like opening the door to waiving those fees. It just, it's Pandora's box.
Yeah.
And you basically, it's one of those things where you have a policy, we don't stand for it.
Yeah, it'd have to go through like a reimbursement type
Yep.
of policy.
And I'm fine with something like that if we wanna put that as a part of it,
It's like, Sagamore fees are a lot lower than I thought they would be.
Well,
I mean, he was asking us if they were gonna be astronomical, so.
Yeah. no, I would say that, a no, but we would like to have a sit down with next meeting.
Sure.
Would be a great way to look forward.
Do you want me to communicate with that person? It's up to you guys, so.
Yeah.
Alright, I'll do that.
Anybody have any other questions? Shannon or Ron on that?
In the policy, and obviously you'll have examples, but in the policy, could we put like, you have to say what your business is trying to bring to the community? Like make a list of,
Sure.
or like pointing out, because then it
No,
prioritizes.
that's kind of the check box
We-
idea.
Yeah, in our,
Oh, okay.
in our current application, I mean,
Oh,
we
I
do
guess.
state,
Okay.
Just
the
kind of
public
list of
purpose
check
requirements in the policy.
What's it?
And then here we have boxes that they check for job creation, tax-based, job retention, removal of blight, housing, redevelopment, land cleanup, other.
Is it just, they just check if they don't?
Yeah, but there's some narrative that comes along with this, and as the, part of the job of anybody facilitating that process is talking about, those findings that we're making in our policy and how this meets those findings or doesn't meet those findings.
Yeah.
So, but if there's items that aren't listed in those public purposes that you think should be, that's what we would want input on, so.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Ron, on that. Moving forward, is there any updates?
No, Jolene wasn't able to come today, so I don't have any updates.
So as far as another member, we're looking for another one. The bank, Joel is left, there's a number of people who have left, I don't see it happening from the bank.
Jeffrey's been talking to the owner of 1212 Meats, and he wasn't able to come today, but we'll try again in April. So that might be a possibility for the future.
How many members do you want?
I think we can have 5 or 7, like a commission, like
I think
we're
5 is
County. Yeah,
You know,
I think we can have up to 7,
Yeah,
just like the other commissions,
Yeah.
but yeah.
just nice when any of us have to miss. a meeting.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
not a
it's still
catastrophe.
Yeah. Which, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, with that, the next meeting will be Tuesday, April 16th, 2024, at 12 p.m. Montrose City Hall. Do I hear a motion for adjournment?
So move to adjourn.
second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks, bye.
Have a good day.
So Jess, you'll forward anything he sends? Okay, perfect. I will